It might have been 20 years ago, but it's a night no one living in the southern half of England anyway at the time will ever forget.
Yeah, the Great Storm of 1987 devastated the landscape in just a few hours, flattening millions of trees, crushing cars and homes and claiming at least 18 lives.
Well, Breakfast's Richard Westcott is at Chartwell in Kent. It was one of the worst affected areas. Good morning to you, Richard. Misty start to the day there.
It is. This is where Winston Churchill used to live, and he said that a day away from Chartwell was a wasted day. You can see why. Now, this yew tree, that survived. But if we pan around here, you might just be able to make out in the mist. It's like a line of jagged teeth over there. All of the tall trees are the few that survived, but about 98–99% of the rest of the trees completely laid waste by this wind. And of course, it happened to lots of areas around here and lots of areas all the way up to the Suffolk and Norfolk coast as well. But there was some good that came out of this storm. It was the most destructive storm for nearly 300 years. 15 million trees were bulldozed in just a few hours. Here's the before. Here's after. Winds gusting up to 110 miles an hour ripped homes open, knocked out power, brought whole counties to a halt. Shanklin Pier on the Isle of Wight had seen off 100 years' worth of storms. This one reduced it to driftwood. In Kent, the wind pushed this ferry onto the shore like it was a dinghy. And on another ferry, Trina Fitzallen-Howard was on her way back from France.
It was the journey coming back that I will never forget. There was a storm brewing, and as soon as we left Calais, we went straight into it. And 12 hours later, we'd felt like we'd been on the spin and wash cycle of a washing machine. It was awful.
Well, I come out about 6 o'clock in the morning, and everything out here was flattened.
20 years ago, George Phillis was working at Emmett's Garden in Kent. Almost all of it was bowled over by the wind.
All of the woodland behind us was completely flattened, the whole thing. The only remaining thing is this one tree, a sweet chestnut, that survived the storm. This one was probably more protected by what was around it.
Even so, 20 years on, the storm looks like it's ended up doing more good than harm.
Zone we're in. This is the control.
Paul Naden works for the National Trust in neighbouring Toys Hill.
We've got far more diverse wildlife, like we've got dormice, nightjars, right through to deer, and then we've got all the high-top birds, and then we've also got bats and birds of prey.
They've learned another valuable lesson too. Nature has proved much better than humans at regenerating the forest.
This is a tree we planted 20 years ago. You can see I can get my hand around it. It's not that big. Now over here, we have a tree that is self-sown and is the same age as that one, and you can see I certainly can't get my hand around that.
Why?
Nature knows best.
There's one final legacy from the Great Storm, and it concerns probably the BBC's most famous weather report.
Earlier on today, apparently, a woman rang the BBC and said she heard that there was a hurricane on the way. Well, if you're watching, don't worry, there isn't.
So, let's put the record straight. Michael Fish was actually talking about a different hurricane, one in Florida. Yet 20 years on, people still think he messed up. Poor old Michael Fish, he'll never live that down, will he? We've had an email in from Paul in Suffolk, said the worst devastation was along the Suffolk and Norfolk coast. Winds averaged 117 to 120 miles an hour, and his village, Friston, was totally cut off for 5 days. So this actually was a storm that covered huge parts of the southern area of England. It wasn't obviously just Kent. There's two important things that came out of it. As Carol will tell you, they've got much, much better technologically at forecasting when these bad storms are coming our way. And secondly, foresters have changed the way they work. As you saw in the film there, they tend to leave it to nature now rather than man plant these trees and shrubs and so on, because nature is better at it.
OK, Richard, thanks very much.
Thank you very much. We've also had an email saying, but there was a hurricane in Florida as well. So we're going to put all of that to Michael Fish himself. He's going to set the record straight. Once again, he's going to be joining us in half an hour to set the record straight, as I say, about what happened in that forecast 20 years ago.
He did say he did an earlier forecast as well, earlier in the day, didn't he, when he said batten down the hatches. So maybe he's off the hook. We'll find out. Now, staying with weather, and it's exactly 20 years since the Great Storm ripped through south-east England. It was the worst in living memory. 18 people lost their lives in it too.
Well, roofs were torn off buildings, of course, trees were uprooted and cars and houses were wrecked. It also led to the most memorable weather forecast in television history.
Earlier on today, apparently, a woman rang the BBC and said she heard that there was a hurricane on the way. Well, if you're watching, don't worry, there isn't.
Now 20 years later, Michael Fish is with us this morning. Michael, to set the record straight, you weren't talking about the storm that hit England?
Not at all. Also, to set the record straight, it was 20 years tomorrow that the storm struck.
Because it was overnight on the 15th.
20 years today was that little infamous forecast.
Right, so what were you talking about there?
Florida, as a matter of fact, nothing to do with it at all. If I could put the finger of blame at anybody, and actually he's quite proud of it now, it was Bill Giles, not my good self, because he was on the afternoon and evening shift, and on instructions from our head office at Bracknell, which is where the forecasts are done, he was told to emphasise the heavy rain and hardly mention the winds, which of course wasn't really the right thing to do.
So how did this confusion come about? Because even today, I have to say, the Mirror here says they've tracked down the woman reported to have phoned into the BBC to say, you know, is there a hurricane? So
no, there was nobody phoning into the BBC. I mean, as you know, nobody can phone us in a live studio. I think I was probably guilty of the first ever BBC phone-in scam. Because
now we should be told then, Michael.
Now I get the sack. Because it was the other way around. There was somebody working in the studio whose mother was going on holiday to Florida. The news had been full of stories about Florida and hurricanes and all the rest of it. So he phoned home, having asked me to reassure his mother that she was safe to go and there was no problem. But because I knew the BBC were very strict on making long-distance phone calls, I just, for his sake, turned it round. And so rather than saying he rang his mother, I pretended his mother rang into him.
So were you doing an international forecast, or you just slipped that bit in and said people are concerned about weather?
The reason I slipped it in was because it was a link to the last item on the news, and unfortunately there's no tape of the news bulletin, so it's totally out of context.
And you had, again, setting the record straight earlier in the day, said batten down the hatches, talking about the storm that did.
Yes, absolutely. Batten in the day, I did a broadcast and opened up that said batten down the hatches, there's some extremely stormy weather on the way.
But you did think it was going to miss the south of England. You thought it was going to hit France, didn't you?
Well, that's right. The Met Office actually did a very good job 5 days ahead, and we issued the warnings on the farming forecast on the Sunday, indicating there would be very stormy weather at the end of the week. But unfortunately, as it got closer and closer and more of the computer runs were done, the computer decided that the track would be a bit further south and eventually that it would be up the English Channel, whereas previously it had thought it would turn up across the southeast of England, and unfortunately, of course, that's exactly what happened.
So when were you first aware of just exactly how bad it was?
Well, I was obviously aware that things were happening around my house, but I had no idea of the severity of the thing until I'd been at work many hours. I went into work at 4 o'clock in the morning, as the worst of the storm had passed in London. But I was sort of merrily working away for several hours before I became aware that there'd been actually a major problem. It just sort of wasn't obvious.
And do you regret the misinterpretation of the forecast? I mean, you know, it's made a bit of a star out of you, haven't you, for the wrong reasons,
yes.
I guess.
I mean, now that I've retired and I can go around the country making, do a few after-dinner speeches and all the rest of it, then, of course, I love it now. But at the time, 20 years ago, I battered my head against a brick wall trying to get the message across. 10 years ago, we did exactly the same, and it didn't work. So even now, I bet when I die, it'll be on my tombstone, but at least I'm going to insist that all those tapes go with me.
It's a shame you didn't insist on a penny for each time that the piece was played.
Absolutely, I could buy the BBC by now.
OK, Michael, good to see you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Today.